Good afternoon, and welcome to St. Joseph's Parish. This is our Advent kickoff program on the idea and the structure of sacred space. Wendy Marble, our art historian, is our guest speaker today. We'd like to thank everyone who is here in person and to remind everyone from home that we are glad that we can present this to you as well, and that there is 2 rows distance between Wendy and the congregation, so she will not be wearing a mask during her presentation. We'd like to thank Tony and his new assistant Sherry for making this possible. And I'd like to introduce not only Wendy Marble, but for the first time, Bob Marble, her husband, who's here with her today. So with that, we will introduce Sylvia with our opening prayer.
Like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house. To tell you the truth, this sounds kind of painful. It sounds complicated and difficult and more than a little bit strange. Stones with a heartbeat, bricks that bleed instead of crumble, mortar that cements living bodies together instead of joining concrete blocks. A building that can weep or dance. Living stones cut and shaped and stacked together, all bearing part of the same load, all part of the same plan. Living stones connected in such a way that they become not a building, but a holy priesthood. Living stones called out of darkness into a wonderful light. This image is vivid and powerful, and it reminds us that no matter how beautiful the sanctuary, no matter how many capital campaigns we launch or gymnasiums we build, no matter how tall that spire stretches into the sky, the house of God is not simply a place, but a gathered people. The house of God is constructed stone by living stone out of people whose lives fit together like tiles around a fireplace, called and chosen, beloved of God, all of us, part of the whole. And so we pray. Lord, vibrant, creating God, we gather in your name with you at our center, and we give thanks for your presence among us, within us. We stand at the beginning of the season of our waiting, ask for patience as we live each day, knowing that each day brings us closer to the realization of your promise. In Jesus' name, we pray and wait in joyful hope.
Okay, is it possible to dim the lights? Thank you. I'm so glad to see you here. I wasn't expecting anybody under the circumstances. Forgive me for taking off my mask, but I hope that you feel safe. My name is Wendy Marble. As you have been told, some of you may recognize me from previous visits. Is there anyone here who's done Advent and Lent? Thank you. Yeah, it's good to see all of you. But of course, all of you are welcome. Your hearts are in the right place as we go forward in this season. Now, I'm not a member of the Catholic Church, and I can hear Mary Kay in her mind thinking, well, not yet anyway. But I lived in 3 Catholic countries and 1 Muslim country over 14 years overseas. And that gave me time as a self-taught artist to become steeped in history and experience, focusing especially on learning the language of Christian symbolism. So my 35 years in creating and teaching about liturgical arts, and the earning of a fine arts degree with a really solid foundation in art history, as well as a 7-year term as a docent at the Ringling Museum. I'm telling you all this so you can decide whether you're going to listen to me or not. But I have to say that's given me a passion for the Catholic Church's 1,700 years of involvement with the arts and worship. So it's a great honor to be invited to participate with you in this Advent kickoff as we think about the future of God's plan for us in this season of hope and anticipation. Thinking about the future of God's kingdom is something I want you to do with me today. And I'll tell you what got me started. Reading about all the technology that was getting sent to Mars this past summer. I mean, NASA sent the rover Perseverance, but United Arab Emirates sent Amal, which means hope, to orbit the planet. And China sent Tianwen-1, that means questions to heaven. I think that's beautiful. Not only to orbit, but to land a rover as well. And then Russia and Europe collaborated to send the ExoMars rover. They had to postpone, but I'm sure they'll get there. And NASA even had a competition for designing building on Mars. Yes? Why don't I just hold the mic closer to my lips? Thank you for telling me that. Does this help? Okay. It's so sad when you go through a whole talk and then people come afterward and say, I didn't hear your word you said, but I'm sure you meant well. It's talking about all the technology that was going to Mars. There's so much, and so it gets your imagination going. It's like, what will that be like? Who will live there? What sort of society will evolve? Will the Catholic Church send missionaries to this new frontier? Even maybe so many parish churches that they have to send a bishop and we'll build a cathedral. It really gets your imagination going. So today, I'm not offering an art history lecture, although I do geek out on that, but thank God that's not happening. What I'm asking you to do is participate in a little flight of fancy and exercise in imagination. Let's pretend that you are a committee that's been commissioned by the Pope to build a cathedral on Mars. And I'm bringing you a design brief, or a mood board, if you will, to just get us started on a brainstorming session. It'll be a little inspiration to look at the history of Christian worship spaces, get a little inspiration from the process of cathedrals through time. And then at the end of this slideshow, I'm going to be asking you to answer me, what are the essentials of a cathedral in the future? So be thinking as you look at these slides about what's attractive to you or what seems important to you. Your opinion matters to me. I'm going to be asking for it. So imagine with me, if you will. You have to think about setting, context, the need of the new community. Well, fortunately, we have a really early God-given template for a worship space that has served us well, the tabernacle. It consisted early on of a portable tent for Israel's most sacred objects, as well as rituals of praise, sacrifice, cleansing. So they had this inner tent, and it was surrounded by an enclosure to define that dwelling space of Yahweh. The tribes of Israel would be ranged around the outside. And then they would come with celebration and singing and music. The tribal leaders would enter to offer their sacrifices and receive atonement and intercession by the priests. But there was a space that, what was this called? Right in here. Does anybody remember from school? Holy of Holies, yes. And who could enter here? Only the priests. But you take a look at this worship pattern, and you may even recognize this pattern here in St. Joseph's. I think that you will be talking more about this in the future. Right, Mary Kay? But I'm fascinated by the fact that this journey that was characterized by the very first worship place, is one that we still take today. Let's move on to just before and during the time of Christ. The Greek polytheistic religion was well established, and it was really characterized by temples that would have a statue of the god or goddess of choice inside, and then a large meeting area, and then these one or two rows of pillars around the whole space. So this, like in the Parthenon, really exemplifies the Greek quest for visual purity in harmony and balance, proportion and color. And we humans have never really walked away from that quest. In fact, I'd say God made us this way. We are physiologically hardwired to prefer balance and symmetry. Romans were also worshipers of many gods and had no problem appropriating the building styles of the Greeks. This cutaway of a basilica or hall of justice shows the aisles and the long central area, which would feature a rounded back wall or an apse where the judge's seat would be raised up, that's right in there, and an effigy, like a portrait or a statue of the emperor, would be visible as well. The Romans brought something new, however, which really turned architecture on its head in their invention of concrete. This enabled the buildings of arches, vaults. I mean, when you think of an arch, and you think of another arch perpendicular to that first arch, that's a vault. Or think of arches side by side, around in a circle, that's a dome. So this enabled the emphasis, the aesthetic view, in other words, to go from the outside to the inside of the building. So you can see that in this, the Pantheon in Rome, they had that classical Greek porch structure on the outside, but something else entirely is going on behind it. And this is the interior of the Pantheon, this incredible dome. So concrete would enable them to build walls higher, allowing for statuary and carvings and paintings, and a new vision for people entering the building. Of course, we don't need all those gods anymore, thank goodness. What a lot to keep track of. What was happening during this time? The life, death, and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. The sending out of the apostles. And the beginning of a new Christian church. The first 200 years, this church was illegal. And then, bam, all of a sudden, was made legal in 313 AD, thanks to God and with the help of the Roman Emperor Constantine, who made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire in 380 AD. So just think about that. Paganism and Christianity switched places in such a short span of time. Talk about a startup needing a new brand. Immediately, builders looked around. The Roman Basilica became the hall church, with separations between the clergy and the congregants, as well as between the converts and the catechumens. The curved apse that contained the Roman judge's throne before, and the emperor's portrait, now contained the altar and depiction of biblical figures, saints, or Jesus. No crucifix yet. That horror was still too fresh. That symbolism didn't come for a while. Here is the earliest St. Peter's in Rome. The construction was started by Constantine himself, and you can see a lot of that basilica, that Hall of Justice shape, but then with the addition of this perpendicular construction which created a Latin-shaped cross when you looked at it from a bird's eye view. But what a fantastic outer courtyard for all those people. They didn't want to come in quite yet. They had to earn their way in, didn't they? It wasn't always like this basilica style, though. Here is San Vitale in Ravenna, Italy, and it really took the shape of a Greek cross with equal sides, and this structure that caps the top hid a secret. Not this particular dome, but the domes were copied all through early Christian architecture. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. See how the cement and the construction has enabled the space to go up and up and up. The earliest artwork then, the artists looked around, what did they see? They had a lot of Greek and Roman sculpture. So, Zeus could turn into an artist's version of a bearded god, our god. Or here is a Roman Apollo as shepherd, then stands in as the metaphor of Jesus as the good shepherd. Even in the times when the Christians met in secret, they would come to bury their dead in the catacombs. You've probably heard this before. But they also worshipped in secret. And so the frescoes that were created in these catacombs often contained some of the earliest depictions. Here is a fresco from the 3rd century, the earliest known depiction of the Virgin Mary, shown as a nurturing mother, which of course has become her most enduring common visual theme. So what was appropriate for a Roman emperor was even more so for the throne of God. The richest materials were used to reflect a heavenly glory, to lift the eyes away from self to a sacred other. Frescoes, gold leaf, and the well-developed art of mosaic began to fill the new Christian churches. This, by the way, is the Church of Saint Sophia in Constantinople, or now Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, which was a museum until recently when they decided to reinstate it as a mosque. But it was the center of church administration during Constantine's time before everything moved west to Rome. Mosaic was a very interesting, powerful art form back at this time, because they could use these little bits of stone and glass to create this subtle shading that was so painterly. Here is Jesus Pantocrator in the Hagia Sophia, Pantocrator meaning Jesus the Almighty, among other things. Christ in Majesty is another translation. And here is the Virgin Mary between two royal patrons. That's Emperor John II and Empress Irene. What a way to raise your status, is get your picture taken with the Virgin Mary. But as the church grew, and these beautiful mosaics were filling the interior spaces, Christian worshipers had never seen anything like it. The power of illustration, storytelling, and revelation must have been breathtaking. So as the church grew and split into the Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East, or Byzantine, and think of it, the Muslim influence and the barbarians, all the influences and wars all around, and the churches going west into Europe. Finally, peace came for a moment and a building boom ensued. What grew from Romanesque, this is an example of Romanesque architecture in Pisa. How can you tell that this is from Pisa, the cathedral in Pisa? You can figure that out, yeah. It still looks pretty grand though, doesn't it? This is my favorite building era, but we're going to brutally skip over it to one that you will recognize as Gothic. This represented a span of incredible artistic and engineering improvement in the service of God. But here's what we think of when we think of Gothic, high Gothic. This is Bourges Cathedral in France. You can recognize the basilica shape with its rounded apse. But look what's happening with the engineers now. They've got these buttresses on the outside called flying buttresses that lead the strain of the weight out and down. So that enabled the inside to have fewer pillars in it, higher spaces. You can also note the arches have developed points, and these tall windows in between the buttresses enable more light to come in. What about the expense of this, though? You as a committee are going to have to keep this in mind. How to haul all this stuff by ox cart or waterways. All that stone dressing and carving and painting and stained glass window creation. I mean, it must have been incredible to try to plan something like this. But you know, the attitude was, this is God's house. No expense must be spared. I mean, the rebuilding of the Chartres Cathedral cost about 50 million at the time, and the Cologne rebuild took 632 years. I'm sure a lot of these rebuilds took just parts by parts by parts as they were able to finance them. Everyone gave what they could, plus there were church property revenues, pilgrimage and relic tours, taxes and indulgences, and then monasteries attached to these cathedrals could provide not only monks for leading the parish churches, but also artisans and labor for the building and maintenance of these cathedrals. All kinds of activities took place in the cathedral, but what was the main function? Worship and liturgy. In other words, honoring God. The church fathers understood the value of engaging the whole person in this activity. And the building itself became a vehicle for the metaphor of this spiritual journey. Let's use Notre Dame here in Paris as an example. You make a conscious choice to enter. You climb some stairs. You're getting ready to leave the world and traverse into a heavenly realm. You're leaving the known, going into the unknown, the presence of God. So you climb stairs. You pass through a doorway where above you you see Jesus on his throne of judgment and the souls being led into heaven or hell, which comes to all of us. And it might be scary, but you are surrounded by this cloud of witnesses, the saints that feel like a supporting family, encouraging you in your choice to go in. So here you go. There's a font and a path. At any point, you can turn and leave. The air is filled with shadow and light, even colored light. In the distance is your goal. The throne of God, a sacrificial altar, the tomb of Jesus. There may be rails in your way. There may be kneelers to cause you to pause. There may be side chapels to distract or enhance your experience. When you turn to leave, you're confronted with this otherworldly circle of color and story as you make your way back out into the world, hopefully renewed or at least convicted by your spiritual experience. Everything is designed to remind you of your faith and draw your eye upward. Even as they work to rebuild Notre Dame in Paris today, do you know that there was a fire last year? Yes. They keep this in mind, this idea of lifting the eyes and consequently the soul upward. Here is the design for the new spire. Something something unique happens in the brain when it's confronted with light passing through color instead of reflected off of color. Stephen Westland from the University of Leeds characterizes this as a physiological mechanism through which color and light can affect mood, heart rate, alertness, and other states of mind. The Church Fathers understood this transformative power and I don't believe churches will ever stop using this effect. This is the National Cathedral, a neo-Gothic example in Washington, D.C. But windows can take any shape. Here's a joyful window. Click, by Henri Matisse. And the space window at the National Cathedral. Look around at St. Joseph's. I've walked with you more than once through this space talking about these windows. And I encourage you to spend time with them again and again and let them speak to you and let this transformative effect of light through color take place in you. You have a stunning example here in St. Joseph's. You're very fortunate. Moving on to other architectural design influences, here's a beauty and a favorite. You remember? Yes. The 15th century Renaissance style cathedral in Florence, Italy. Now here is a return to a more classical style. None of that flighty nonsense from France. But oh, what a dome. I've been reading a book about it. It's very dramatic how it came to be. During this time, there is a shift from near to distant vision, so a desire for longer horizon. We are self-centered and also horizon-seeking, and more height. And from this otherworldly Gothic pseudo-realism to a more symbolic and iconic language to answer the need to portray not what is seen, but what is known through faith. Here is St. Peter's in Rome, the new version, as it were, at this time. But please understand the architects and artists were not working independently, but were responding directly to the aesthetic and theological directives of the church leaders. So what comes next, the Baroque, may seem overwhelming, even decadent to us, but it was designed to engage the emotions of the faithful during the tumultuous Counter-Reformation. So whatever was going on, the theologians were thinking about it, writing about it, and talking about it, and then the artists and architects were responding. Meanwhile, back east, the Orthodox Church is evolving its own style, one of it which is joyously delivered here in the domes and spires of St. Basil's in Moscow. There's plenty for church architects to draw from, but generally in Europe and America over the next 200 years, we just go through phases of revivals of all the styles you've just seen. Until the 20th century, when a new modernist style blew the lid off of architectural norms and the Catholic Church was at the cutting edge. I get very excited by this era, by the attention to spiritual needs and the quest for new experiences in worship space. I will quietly, though, show you a few examples for a little bit of inspiration as we get ready to segue into our discussion about our future church on Mars. That was the cathedral in Brasilia, Brazil, and this is the interior. Remember what I said about light through colored glass and lifting the eye upward, connoting a heavenly space with these flying angels. Here's a little church in Connecticut. I wanted to share these glass walls with you so you could see the effect. Then there's the Catholic Chapel of the Holy Cross in Sedona, Arizona, as if it were rising up spontaneously out of the red rocks. Contextually relevant because we're going to have red rocks on Mars. but actually inside is a very reverent and intimate worship space, looking out across this red horizon. The Crystal Cathedral, which is now Christ Cathedral, owned by the Catholic Church. The Jubilee Church in Rome. We're getting very futuristic here, aren't we? The Northern Lights Cathedral in Norway, clad in titanium. And here's a little gem I couldn't resist. San Giovanni Battista in Switzerland. Every image I found, everywhere you look, is a dizzying spectacle. The effect on your brain is really something. But now let's look into the future. The winners of NASA's Mars Building Contest used roving 3D printers. And instead of water, of which there is none, basically, on Mars, they could melt sulfur, which has its own scriptural connotations. But then these buildings could be remelted and reused, remade out of the same material. This is a design winner by Albert Kahn. Second place winner by Team Zophorus. An AI Space Factory won first place. On the right-hand side is the model that they set up here on Earth. On the left is what they imagine happening in Mars. What do you imagine happening on Mars? You're the committee. You're going to have to think about a few essential, I made lots of pages so we could scribble on them. A few essential points. This is very dry stuff, but it's important. Physical requirements, user experience, the context and the setting. Well, it's like nothing we've ever seen before. The cost and time and money, and the maintenance. This is all well and good, but let's get down to a little more essential thing. The function of a church building is to convert visitors into worshipers. When I read this, it gave me pause. I had to think about it, because that's a little bit abrupt. But it's true. When you think about the worship spaces you have been in that really moved you, how do you do that? Well, let's start with this question. What is worship? Oh, look. Yes, thank you. Mary Kay, if you want to put the lights back up, we're done with the slides, that little reverie of art history. Now I need your brains. What is worship? If you get scared and you don't want to answer, after teaching Sunday school for 16 years, I know that that happens. And I know that if my students wait long enough, I'll just answer the question myself. What is worship?
Giving our attention over to God.
So attention like focus. You're just hitting on some really important things. Thank you. Worship. Worship. Spell it.
I was just saying, like work, like instead of saying worship.
Yes, okay. Yeah, I just couldn't hear what you said. But the definition at the highest level, you said?
It's just saying that we worship is your acknowledging it as the highest knowledge.
Yes. Which will help you decide about materials, setting, shape of the building. I heard somebody else say something. Praise, yes. I like that. That is an important function. It's a good word. I like it. Man's response to God's call, essentially. Tell me what you were thinking. Yes, thank you. That's a very important consideration. I'll tell you why I believe it is so. Your spiritual leaders can tell you all the wrong things I said after I'm done. But in the history of religion as it came from Europe to America, and in other religions, we have a tendency to focus on the intellect. And that cannot be denied. We have text and scripture that must be interpreted. We have moral training and things to, learn and memorize that must be paid attention to. But I believe that God created us to strive for Him, to meet Him through our imagination. That the imagination is God's language with us. And so the Catholic Church has never, ever dropped the ball in understanding that God is going to reach us through our senses, as well as any other part of us you can name. So if your worship space engages you at the highest level, your intellectual curiosity, challenge, but also the imagination and the senses, what is going to happen to you? What did you want to say, sir?
I would add the words of maybe all would be part of it, but it's more than that. It's overwhelmed and humbled.
Thank you.
My wife and I visited that chapel out in Arizona, and it's dark. It's very small. Nothing in there but several views. Look out through that glass across. When Rose walked up to the altar, knelt down to see the right thing to do, and started crying.
Yes.
Crying like baby. And we looked at each other like, what's going on? I think it's just adoration, the beauty, the starkness, just God. Evoked a response that couldn't be put into words.
This gentleman is talking about his and his wife's response to the chapel in Sedona, Arizona, and I reflect and mirror your words perfectly. That was my experience there, which is the point behind that quote, turning visitors into worshipers. You were engulfed with these emotions, and your response was appropriate for a worship space. Not every space is going to make us do that. But Mary Kay and I have visited the Basilica of the Blessed Virgin in Washington, D.C., and we could hardly stand to leave. We were just so, despite the mosaic of Jesus at the front of the church, we still were just so moved to worship in that place. So I agree with you. Keeping God the focus, or being nudged into keeping God the focus, being nudged into expressing or striving to comprehend the inexpressible. This is the function of the space. All these things that you said. So I guess what you're saying to me is that stuff goes on in the church. What did you do this morning? That's liturgy at the highest level, if you give yourself to it, right? Because that's what is being provided for you through tradition, through rite, through sacrament, through ritual. So your worship space has to support that, but it also has to transcend. That's a tricky thing. You can't just be all Hollywood about it. That's where keeping the focus on God rather than ourselves as artists has been a lifelong challenge for Christian artists, which, by the way, are very rare creatures. And if you want to keep your church worship art in your worship space alive, hire living artists. Don't just keep going back to the basilica of old. Make it a basilica like this. So what happens in this space? You're very understanding about this part. But what about the liturgy itself? What happens? What is important? What do you want to take with you? Music is good. Music is another form of an invitation to transcendence. Thank you, Catholic Church. Cathedrals support the choral tradition and have for hundreds of years. What else happened this morning? Oh, we have lights, candles. You had a baptism? Oops, that's cool. So you had a sacrament. So the worship space has to include the function of sacrament and rituals, right? So who does this work? Okay, that's a very important thing to take with us to Mars. Priests. And who sat and watched the priests do this? The people. Congregation. When you talk about music, I feel like we're touching on all the things we do to celebrate God, to celebrate our gratitude in God's presence. But there's also prayers of confession, and what is the thing that we get after we confess? Yeah, pardon, that's important. Prayers of, what else? What else do you pray for? There's intercessory prayers. Did I say that already? So with celebration comes the opportunity for meditation. There are two kinds, they say. There's the ascetics, those that want to do, that like to do. My husband's an ascetic. And then there are the mystics who find God through meditation and contemplation. That's me. So between the two of us, we're just awesome, aren't we? So, but you must reach out to all believers in that sense. Not all seekers and all curious. You're serving, you have to decide in the committee what is the congregation that you're serving. But you provide for them celebration, praise, but also awe in the meditation, the transcendence, call to action. And what did I see while I was waiting to come in here today, happening just outside the doors? Fellowship. That's another function of your church, isn't it? Fellowship. I could just write straight across the front of this, communion. Is this helping you think about the function of worship space? One last question, and then I'll set you free because your tummies are rumbling, I'm sure. What symbols do we want to take forward? Now, just to help you out, because your brains may be tired, I've made a little list and we can decide if any of these are important. I find that in the grand scheme of things, this is kind of a basic thing that we're trying to not just maintain for the believers, but to convey to those who are visiting and waiting to be met at the highest level and transformed into worshipers. But this is fairly abstract. So let's take a look at some of the material or more coherent things that we want to take. Do you think that a crucifix is a symbol you want to take with you? Mention the candle. Why is there, oh, yes. Yes. Host, thank you. That was the very next thing on my list. So that's part of the light, that symbol of light. Mary Kay, I think you taught me that in the Key West, remember? In some places, especially where I've lived overseas and people travel to go visit soldiers or military outposts that are far, far away, or even just a group of soldiers that are just standing on a hillside, there's a sense of a minimum amount to signify, okay, now we're worshiping. And the crucifix is one, the cross, or just even a little table to set the cross and the communion cup and plate on. So priests and people, we've talked about that. Rituals, catechisms. Listen, this is what's fun about stained glass and mosaic. You can teach a lot of things, even almost subconsciously, as they did in the olden days when people weren't so literate, didn't know how to read. That was a real big function of the stained glass windows. This language of symbolism has been lost in a postmodern world. So you, the committee, have to decide, okay, what are the most important symbols, and then just keep hammering home what they mean. I'll bet you get some of that in your church services here. What does this mean? Why is it like this? But here are other things. Do you want to keep a calendar? Do you want to enforce certain holy days? What would that look like in the new space? Do you want the priesthood to be dressed differently from everybody else? Hymns, scripture, prayers. These are the things that you have to decide. How are we going to include these in our worship space? Who is going to be coming to participate in these things? How are we going to tell them what these symbols mean? How are we going to show them our hearts? How are we going to express the inexpressible? I want to thank you so much for your patience and time with me today. I love being here with you. It means so much to me that you feel the curiosity and the yearning to learn more and to think more. If you're interested, I have taught many classes on Christian symbolism and worship design, and there are some handouts from previous lectures on the front pew here that kind of encapsulate a lot of the things that we talked about today, and even a little bit more. And if you need specific dates and names, if you're an art history buff, I do have a slide list with me, and I can also email that to you. Once again, yes, Mary Kay.
Can you just express what we talked about at the beginning of why in our situation do people feel so comforted when they came back to the sacred space during the time of the pandemic? What was that? How can we put into terms what that joy meant?
What Mary Kay is talking about is that she came across some blogs about church leaders talking about the situation we're in now, and where you and I want to come back to the sacred space we know, whereas many people are staying home and watching stuff online or on their phones, going to the beach, and that's becoming their new worship pattern, is this two-dimensional flat, in my opinion. It's something I do think about a lot. Because here you're in a three-dimensional space. You're being engaged through your senses. Think of incense and communion and the feel of people, other worshipers around you as you engage together in this act of worship. And we can't get that online. However, when going to Mars, technology may be a huge part of our experience there, just out of necessity. So we're in conflict. Mary Kay and I think we're commiserating and sort of grieving that people are losing out on this three-dimensional experience. How do we call people back to the particular pleasure in that? To understand that God needs the whole person at the highest level. This is a good question, isn't it? What do we... There's a danger there, and this is every church across the world. But Blaise Pascal talked about that God-shaped void. We know there's a hunger. And yes, there's a hunger for a spiritual language, and it shows up in the tattoos of people. There's a hunger, there's still an understanding of the power of symbols in those tattoos, of personal and communal meaning. So I hope that you have a chance to think about this and pray about this as we go into the Advent season, thinking about what would we do without that baby boy in the manger. Thank you, Mary Kay, for inviting us.